On the 9th of September 2021, the fisherwomen from Pulicat Wetlands to the north of Chennai, India, wrote a letter to the Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu state. They invited him to their village to attend a seafood feast on 16th October, the UN World Food Day. Making a promise to please the palate and relax the mind of the Chief Minister with Pulicat's specialities and signature recipes made with fresh catch from the wetland, the women reminded him of his electoral promise to protect the wetland on which their lives, living spaces, and livelihoods depend.
A food festival to protect wetlands. I was really intrigued by this premise. To a story told at a public event by Ain Contractor, an architect and a master's student at Institute of Hydrological Education in Delft, the Netherlands. It is a story of a kind of ecosystem called wetlands, which we refer to more commonly as marshes and swamps, and consider them to be wastelands of no use. It is a story of how important they are, really, and all that they provide not just to the folks living within them, but also to cities that are constantly expanding and constantly encroaching upon them. This is also a story of who lives in the wetlands, who cares for them, nurtures them, keeps them going, and how caste and gender influence all that. So Ain, the women of Pulicat Wetlands, invited the Chief Minister to this food festival to remind him of his promise to protect the wetlands that they lived in. What did the wetlands need protecting from?
In this case of the letter, the women are talking about protecting the wetland from a port expansion, which is the Kattupalli port. It is in North Chennai, and there's been a proposal to expand it by the Adani Port Private Limited. So it would increase the cargo handling capacity of the port approximately 13 times. And as a result of the large area of the wetland that it would encroach, as well as approximately 2,000 acres of land which would be reclaimed from the sea by by dumping sand and stones. This kind of infrastructure development on the coast threatens not only the fishing grounds of the coastal communities, but also increases chances of flooding. And these women, they live in Pulicat, which is really situated at the juncture where a river, which is the Kosasthalya River, which is the largest river of Chennai, enters the Bay of Bengal, and then also spills into the second largest brackish water lake of India, which is the Pulicat Lake, and it is a protected sanctuary. And so this confluence where Pulicat is located, it's a very delicate ecology, separated, like the river runs parallel to the coast, and it is separated with the coast by a very thin stretch of land. And this stretch of land has already been facing a fast rate of erosion, coastal erosion. So the port, which would come to the south of this stretch of land, threatens to erode this little stretch and thereby completely change this ecology and destroy the saltwater lake. So that's what they're talking about, yeah.
What are wetlands, though? It's not a term we use in day-to-day vocabulary. Are they the same as marshes or swamps?
So I will read the official definition from the Ramsar Convention, which describes wetlands as areas of marsh, fen, peatland, or water, whether natural or artificial, permanent or temporary, with water that is static or flowing, fresh, brackish, or salt, including areas of marine water, the depth of which at low tide does not exceed 6 meters. So this is a very, very technical definition. And the same thing if you were to ask a fisher or somebody from an indigenous coastal community, they would have a very different way of explaining what a wetland is, where the wetland is a very intricate mosaic of ecologies created by the overflow of seawater into freshwater sometimes, and then freshwater into seawater sometimes. So in a very simple way, I would say a wetland is land which is sometimes more wet and sometimes less wet. But the quality of the water, the brackishness of the water changing affects what are the different activities that can be done on that area. And this, which could be a range of things from farming to fishing to salt production. And here I'm talking about coastal wetlands specifically, but wetlands can also be freshwater wetlands which are inland. So this entire mosaic of ecologies are what we would call a wetland. But because the definition of a wetland is so ambiguous, and also the appearance of a wetland is changing through the year because it's a seasonal occurrence, actually not having a strict definition of what a wetland is one of the reasons for the loss of wetlands, because it's very difficult to make a boundary and say, well, this is the start of the wetland and this is the end of the wetland. And so it becomes difficult in development plans for the state to mark its boundaries and say what is protected. Also, many times the wetlands are easily encroached upon because they could be dry for a long time and then something is built on it. So yeah, your question about what is a wetland is really a question many people are asking.
So if one were to walk into a wetland, let's say the Pulicat wetlands, where you have been and where you have worked, what would one see? What would one hear? What would one experience?
When I went, it was winter. And in Chennai, it rains in the winter. So this was when the water levels were higher than the dry season. So different parts of the wetland look also different. So in Pulicat, you have the coast, which looks over the Bay of Bengal. And here the waters are blue, green, very pristine in Pulicat. So if you're looking east, that's what you would see. If you just turn on the spot, you would find a thin strip of vegetation and then fresh water, which is the Kosasthalya River, which has shallow flats, and then it's a more or less a shallow river. People used to walk across it until the bridge was built of Pulicat town. And if you go further inland, which is where Sengani Meda is, there you would see little streams of water where the ground is mushy for sometimes 1 to 3 feet. You would see cattle grazing in this. You would see groups of women squatting in this water, feeling the ground with their hands and grazing the ground with their hands and collecting prawns. And in the distance at the horizon, you would see very heavy machinery and chimneys, large chimneys of thermal power plants and huge cranes of the ports that already exist on the coast of Chennai. So that's the visual. And then you would see mangroves, and you would be able to walk through the mangroves. Actually, this is something that I was doing during my fieldwork, walking with the women among the mangroves.
And people who live in the wetlands, what do they do? What occupations are to be seen there? And again, you could talk specifically about the Pulicat wetlands.
If you belong to the traditional fishing community, then you could have fishing rights either in the sea or in the river, or alternatively on both sides. And so, you would be using nets and line hooks and fishing. On the other hand, you could be a hand picker of prawns and crabs and fish. You could also be a rice farmer, or you could be a peasant working on rice farms of other people. There is salt production as well, but I did not go to study the salt producers. But more or less, most people are involved with fishing in some or the other way. Either they are catching fish themselves, or they are involved in selling fish or preserving fish. Mm-hmm. So mostly related to fishing. On the other hand, you could be working in the port but many times the fishers themselves might be working in these industries as well. And then also fishing by night.
People who do not live in wetlands, why should they care about the state of the wetlands? For example, in this case, why should residents of Chennai care about the Pulicat wetlands?
Wetlands provide very important what are called ecosystem services. There's a typical framework to describe ecosystem services, which divides them in four types: provisional, regulating, habitat, and cultural services. Not everybody agrees with this kind of framework, and there is very sound critique to it, but for the purpose of this, to make it a bit easier. So provisional services would include everything that the wetland is providing in terms of, let's say, fish or water for rice or whatever. Regulating services are like, for example, flood regulation, carbon sequestration, groundwater or salinity regulation. Then there are habitat services in the sense that wetlands are very biodiverse hotspots. And so they provide habitat to a wide range of species. And then there are cultural services in the sense that in a lot of places, people have cultural roots in these wetlands. Their identities may be connected to these wetlands. Then there are also recreational services, etc. But for the case of Chennai, at this moment, the biggest concern or the biggest reason why people need to be concerned about the wetlands is flooding, because Chennai has been, for the last 4 or 5 years, been seeing every year increasingly worse floods. And these floods have been attributed to land use change and encroachments on water bodies. Most of those encroachments have been carried out by the public sector itself. So really, it is a question of mitigating these floods or managing these floods. But at the same time, Chennai also has a reduction in freshwater availability, and wetlands will regulate salinity. So they stop or reduce saltwater ingression. This is also a big reason. And then there's the question of social justice as well, because so many indigenous communities are completely dependent on these wetlands, and their cultural identities are tied to those wetlands as well. So the destruction of these wetlands increases inequalities in the city. And that is something that the people of Chennai need to be and are concerned about.
Going back again to the food festival with which we began this conversation, it seems that it was the fisherwomen who were inviting the chief minister. It was the fisherwomen of the area who were organizing the event. Why women? What were the men up to at that point of time?
The coastal communities or the coastal fisher communities in Chennai have been involved for over a decade in advocacy against insensitive development along the coast, and they have been doing community mapping exercises to register their customary uses and traditional rights of the coast. So the men of these communities have already been involved in campaigns and raising awareness about the destruction of their fishing grounds. But the seafood festival particularly was a way that women became involved. When the proposal for the port expansion was put in public view, and the Coastal Resource Center, which is a research organization and also solidarity organization, and they offer legal, technical, media support to communities that are affected by land degradation, coastal degradation. So they studied this proposal, and when they took this proposal to the local communities, the reaction of the women was quite particular, because they began to talk about what kind of fish would no longer be available by the destruction of this and this particular fishing ground. And then they said, well, but our recipes, what will happen to our food? And that was there because women are typically in charge of food at home, and they are custodians of this culinary culture. And that sparked the idea that, okay, then food needs to be a big part of the campaign, because also not only them, but other people in Chennai are enjoying these recipes like the prawn biryani, which comes from there, or the fish curries that come from there. And so the idea of this food festival began by the interaction of solidarity organizations with local coastal communities.
So, in your dissertation, you focus on women fishers. I understood from it that women fishers and men fishers are different in terms of what they fish for, in terms of how they fish. So, if you could talk a bit about that, in what ways exactly are they different from each other? How are their portfolios different?
Wetland access in this region is very much affected by caste structures. And women from traditional fishing communities, which would be in this context a relatively higher caste, in that caste or in that community, women, they do not go to catch fish themselves. So fishing is the job of the men, and what the women do is all the post-processing. That's the way that it's divided. However, when amongst scheduled tribe communities and scheduled caste communities, women also go to fish. So this is the first difference, that not all the women are fishing. And then within these scheduled caste and scheduled tribe communities, the difference between the men and the women fishers are that the women fishers are not allowed to use any tools. So they cannot use nets, and all they use is what they call a pari, which is a cane backpack. And so they squat in the water, and as they collect prawns or crabs, they just put it into this backpack, and that's what they're allowed to use. The men from these communities, if they are able to afford it, they will use nets. But access to technology it costs money. So it depends a lot on how economically privileged that family is. Yet, even if money is available, women would not be allowed to use nets. And there were many reasons given to me for this, including, one lady told me that the nets are too heavy for us to use, so I don't have that kind of muscle in my chest to throw these heavy nets. And in fact, she even asked her son to bring the net and illustrate how heavy it is and how difficult it is. And in the same breath, this same woman told me about how when the tide is high and the water level is high, she squats in the water while another person stands on her shoulders, and she collects the prawns and passes it to this person, and that person puts it in the backpack. So, and she said, and I have the breath in me to do it. So there were all these contradictory things. And some women said that I don't have the money to buy the net. Some women said that's just how it is, and that's how it is. I don't know how to use this net. So there are many different explanations given to it, but by and large, you're not allowed to use tools. So what that means is that these women they make, no matter how many hours they work or how long they work, they will only collect a small amount of prawns, which means that they must work every single day to collect that prawn and then sell it. And so they must do this every day.
You also mentioned in your dissertation that it is these women belonging to so-called lower castes that maintain the wetlands to the extent that they literally replenish or create the wetlands by literally planting the trees, mangrove trees, which is a rather complex task that demands a lot of skill, a lot of practice.
Yeah, I mean, also planting a tree anywhere is a physically strenuous task, but particularly so in the wetlands or in a wetland, because you have to dig in muck or in wet earth, and it's more sticky, more difficult to dig, more difficult to keep aside. Apart from this, also mangrove saplings require to be watered with a particular water salinity as well. So they don't live on fresh water. So this is another kind of detail that needs to be looked at by the women who do the planting. And apart from that, it requires a lot of protection because it's growing, it's being planted. These women are planting it on common lands, or what are forest lands, let's say. And so there are often cattle grazing. There are other fishers who might trample on them or uproot them to install their own nets or whatever. So protecting these mangrove saplings then is another task until they are able to establish themselves a bit. So these are all things that make it quite peculiar. And then also the very fact that the women who go into the wetlands to fish and who stand in this water, there's a certain association with who is that kind of person. So women from traditional fisher communities, they would not go into this water and stand in this, wet earth, because it would be beneath their caste to do it. And so that feeds into another question that you asked me about why is it that the most marginalized people seem to be doing environmental protection work, and that is also because they are in such closer physical contact with these ecosystems, and therefore hold traditional ecological knowledges about those ecosystems, which they can only gather by daily interaction with it. So these women know, every day they are standing in it. If the water quality changes a little bit, they know it. When there is industrial pollution, they know it. Their skin is the indicator. So some of the women, they told me, oh, when you see the women who fish, you will know about the pollution because it's on their skin. So certain things, knowledge is also connected with identity. Like what you know is very much dependent on who you are, where you're placed, what you do every day. People who are most dependent on open land for their survival have the biggest interest in protecting it, which seems logical, right? And so they spend their time on doing that, or they would participate in these kind of programs. They very much know that, well, if I increase the mangrove cover here, it will improve the prawn production.
Why do you think this impression has been created that women should not use tools for fishing?
I don't think I should be saying why, but it is a reflection of the gender norms of this place. And in a patriarchal system, gender norms are to be followed strictly. There's always a certain way that women must behave and men must behave, and that creates power hierarchies between them. And access to tools is, in my experience working with also farmers before in Tamil Nadu, always gendered. There's also a certain understanding about skill. You need skill to use the net. And women are not considered skilled.
So fishing with hands, not using tools or machinery, could that be described as artisanal fishing? In today's world, artisanal, anything sounds like a good thing, no? So is artisanal fishing more sustainable? Is it better for the environment? And do fishermen in Pulicat wetlands do artisanal fishing because of all its positive aspects? Or if they had means and resources to buy big fishing boats and all sorts of tools and machinery and fish at large scale, would they switch to that?
I wouldn't say that artisanal fishing is only fishing that is done without tools or hand picking. No. Like at this moment, also artisanal fishers now use fiber plastic boats, for example. They use motors on their boats. But the scale of fishing remains smaller as compared to trawlers. Sometimes fishers might contribute money together and get a bigger boat and go for deep sea fishing as well. But from what I understood there's an intricate system of distributing fishing rights, and that would be a part of the ecosystem of artisanal fishing, let's say, and that regulates access, and so also distributes access, and is something that has developed over several generations. There are also certain understandings of when to fish and where to fish. And all the women I spoke to who were handpickers displayed a very strong motivation to ensure the propagation of the species that they depend on. For example, they spoke about how they don't pick baby prawns, or they don't go to fish in the paths where they know the prawns are breeding. They wait, and they said that, well, if you pick everything, what will be left? So even this kind of intimate interaction, the dependency, the daily dependency, all of these to me are part of artisanal fishing. A lot of the techniques have now been lost already. For example, one fisher, a male fisher, he told me about how previously when they used their catamarans for fishing, and they would be just a thin, flat boat made of logs that are tied together. So however close you tie them, there would still be gap between the planks, right? And so they use these sticks to row the boat, and they would put their ear to these cracks and listen for the fish. And they would be able to tell which fish, what size, and where it is by simply listening to the. And so now with a motorboat, this is lost because the sound of the motor is so much that obviously you cannot hear the fish anymore. So these kind of techniques are also evolving and are some getting lost or some changing. And then there was also some descriptions about sharing of knowledge between fishing villages. So if a fisher discovers a fishing ground or a place where there is a seasonal fishing ground, let's say, it's imperative on them that they should share this knowledge with the others. And that's part of the system. And if they don't do it, then there will be social repercussions for it. Maybe for a couple of days, they may take advantage of it on their own. But otherwise, there's an understanding that we are a fisher community and we have to share these grounds with everybody. And so those interpersonal relationships between artisanal fishers are also part of the artisanal fishing economy. Now, if you juxtapose this against industrial scale fishing, where the boats or the trawlers are owned by people who don't live there even, by large companies who employ people to, all of these interpersonal relationships are then no longer existing and therefore no longer barriers in things to dictate behavior. So there's very little accountability, and it's more a question of how much can you get from the sea. So it's much more extractive in nature. Would fishers who have more money buy bigger boats and do larger scale fishing? Sure. That's true. That's obvious. But still, because they live as a community and all of the villages along the coast of Tamil Nadu and even Andhra Pradesh to the north of that, the fisher communities are very much connected with each other. They have familial connections. And so they function in a way to protect the coast together because their collective livelihood is dependent on it. And this is an interesting aspect of how the economy and the interpersonal relationships are very closely mingling.
In your dissertation, you reported several conversations in which, when you asked some women in Pulicat what they did, they would say that they just stayed at home, they did nothing. But in the same conversation, sometimes in the same breath, they would mention all the different things they did, like cleaning the fish that was caught, taking it to the market or distribution centers, packing it in ice boxes, drying it, etc., etc. So it sounded like a very full, very busy day, a very hectic schedule, a lot of hard work. And then at the same time, the description of it is that they do nothing. What is that?
The way I understood it is that not only in this community or in this town, but all over the world, we have a certain understanding of what is to be considered work. And not all labor is called work. So the status of being somebody who works or who contributes to economy is often gendered, casteist, or mediated by different power hierarchies. Also, when you go to work, what work you do or are having opportunity to do is also often mediated by these social hierarchies. And then how much that work is valued in terms of like socially valued and economically valued both, this also is affected by the identity of the person who does that work. And this is what the lens of care brings attention to, because care work is often undervalued. So women are not calling themselves fishers, especially in the traditional fishing communities. The men in the community, they own the boat, they get identity cards from the government which say fisherman with the name of this person and so on. And the women do not get any such recognition. So all the tasks that they do at home are what they do at home. So if you ask them what do, they say we are at home. All these different tasks that they're doing are sort of taken for granted that these things will be done without without financial remuneration. So many times women I would ask them, what do you do? And they say, I'm home. And then you ask them, okay, what time do you wake up? And they would say 3. And then start telling me all these things they have to start doing when they wake up at 3. And that could include going to collect water, going to collect wood to heat this water so that the kids can bathe, so that the people who go to work can be ready to go to work. They need to wake up so much earlier than them to prepare all these things, to prepare food for them, etc., etc. So then I just stopped asking the question about like, what do you do? I would say, tell me in detail your whole day, describe your whole day. And they would be really amused. Why would you want to know? Because I don't think anybody's asking them this question really. And they thought it was funny that I was so interested to know when they're eating, what time they're waking up, so on and so forth. So that was the skirt around it.
Ain, you're an architect. So as an architect, please answer this. What is infrastructure, and why does infrastructure development always seem to be at loggerheads with the ecosystem, with common land and everything nice, really?
Typically, the way we understand infrastructure is like built infrastructure, such as dams, bridges, roads, canals. This is what we call infrastructure. But similar, like even in architecture, there's a saying that everything is architecture. So there are things that are visible, and then there are things that are invisible. And then there are things which are invisibilized. So infrastructure, is it not possible for us to see the planting of these mangroves in a way as infrastructure? Because it is creating habitat. It's a living infrastructure in a sense. The wetland itself is a living infrastructure, and that is a way for us to see space and see natural ecosystems. So the reason why we feel like infrastructure is somehow always at loggerheads with nature, so to say, is because we are only considering a certain kind of infrastructure to be infrastructure. We're not able to see value in life-supporting systems. And that is a fault, or that's more about our own views or whose views we are considering, right? It's like development. What is development? You ask 30 people, they will tell you 30 different things. For some people, development is rubble or displacement.
Thanks, Ain. Let's end on that very important question, that very stimulating food for thought. Talking of food, if you're interested in finding more about the Pulicat Seafood Festival, about its past and future editions, do check out the links in the description. Also in the description are links to more information regarding the proposed port project and Pulicat community's efforts against it. In the next part of this conversation, we'll talk more about that. It'll be out soon. Thanks for listening.